I don't drink alcohol. I drink Arizona green tea, and I am going to crack open a bottle of this in celebration of the death of Rareware, the death of Microsoft, the death of Xbox. How unbelievable is it that we've spent the past 25 years being told that Rareware is past their prime and they're not good anymore and they can't put out good games, and yet people still don't want to acknowledge why. They don't want to admit that Nintendo was directly involved in all of Rareware's hits in the 90s. They do not want to admit that the N64 was an amazing platform. They don't want to admit that Rareware made a mistake selling themselves to Microsoft. This is something that people who are casual observers of the situation don't understand, is that Rareware sold their half of the company. Well, more like 51%, not quite a half. 51% of their company to Microsoft, and Nintendo sold their shares afterward. You don't see people acknowledge, the reality of the situation is that everything bad that's happened to Rareware over the past 25 years, all the terrible 4Kids television series, the failure of all their new IPs, their inability to create like new titles on Xbox, all the canceled projects, the failed revivals, like Killer Instinct, which a lot of people still refuse to admit is a failure, by the way. And, where we're at now, Kinect Sports and the cancellation of Everwild and Joe Dark, featuring a masculine character, Rareware has just been like in free fall for like a very, 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 very long time, and yet like people really didn't want to admit it, because for the longest time, back in the 2000s, the narrative was that Nintendo failed because they allowed Rareware to go. That was like the big prevailing narrative, in the 2000s, and it's become apparent over time that Nintendo absolutely did the right thing in kicking Rareware to the curb, because they were causing problems. They were causing delays. They were like making ludicrously expensive products, like forcing them to package in the expansion pack in with every copy of Donkey Kong 64 is a really, really good example. The prevailing narrative that like Rareware carried the N64 is completely and utterly false. Of course they put out a lot of classic games, a lot of games that are still played and enjoyed to this day. But the N64 was a fantastic console that like far surpassed the PS1 in general, right? And that continued into the GameCube era, even without them, This idea that Nintendo was failing, after the Rareware era when completely laughable. Okay, I've talked about this before, but I'm seeing like people like Andre Segers like try and come out and say like, well, actually, Nintendo has lost every console generation other than the Switch, and I'm just like, they've been profitable every year since like 1981, other than like 2013 or 2014. I don't remember what it is, and that was just because of a new console launch. Generally speaking, Nintendo is an extremely successful company. And yet there's this prevailing narrative that actually, PlayStation sells more. Like, the PS2 is the best-selling console ever. Like, hey, genius. You know how much money they lost on the PS3? The PS3 by itself wiped out all the profits of the PS1 and the PS2. That is just, the reality that people don't want to admit, is that Nintendo actually makes money on their shit. And, PlayStation doesn't. They don't want to talk about profits. They want to talk about things that don't actually matter, fake sales numbers and trying to gaslight you into thinking that kids don't play Mario anymore. It's their entire industry has always been built around this idea of pretending as if Nintendo is perpetually on the verge of bankruptcy, and the reality is so far in the other direction that I think people would be shocked by it. The fact that just how well run of a company Nintendo actually is. They have to be the best, the most well run entertainment company in the world right now. It's crazy how much they've built up their brand, and everything they've accomplished over the years. And like with with the upcoming Donkey Kong Bonanza, like it shouldn't like the reality of the situation should become clear. Like Nintendo did not need Rareware to produce Donkey Kong Country, and that's just the reality of it. Like Rareware was a partner and they did a great job and they gave their own unique vibe to it. Like yeah. But like Retro Studios came in and did it better on the Wii, and now we have like a completely new original concept, produced by the teams at Nintendo that's like far beyond anything Rareware could have made. And that's just like spitting facts. And obviously, you have all the other stuff Nintendo has done over the years, like introduce Splatoon and Arms. While Rareware is just floundering about, like incapable of getting like Everwild even out. Like I don't even think I know what the game even is. Like the last major game that Rareware put out was Sea of Thieves, and that was an abject failure. In spite of the PC gaming community's like endless attempts at trying to gaslight you into thinking that the cosmetic patches somehow fix the game and make it like anything other than completely unplayable. Rareware has been a joke for a long time. And my assertion as a Nintendo fan is that it is entirely of their own doing. They refuse to put out new interesting content. They refuse to put out a new Banjo game. They refuse to do what needs to be done. They just want to be lazy, and they just want to coast off of Microsoft money. And I do think that's like the long and short of it, as like why this acquisition happened to begin with, is because they were tired. Tired of working for Nintendo, actually having to like produce results and actually having like something to show for it. What they wanted to do, like, oh, I want to have sex jokes in my games, and I want to be adult. I want to make mature games for mature gamers. And what happens? Nobody cares about Perfect Dark Zero. Nobody cares about Killer Instinct. Like nobody cares about like anything they've done since then. Grab by the Ghoulies is like one of the worst games they ever put out. Like they wanted to go in this like dark, edgy direction, and it just completely blew up in their face. They in a lot of ways, I think they fell for like a lot of the propaganda being thrown at Nintendo at the time. The Conqueror thing is a really interesting example of this because, the story always has been this idea that they completely retooled the game because they didn't like game journals making fun of it at conferences. And it's just like, who cares? Who cares what game journals think? Especially today, the idea is so laughably stupid. But, the fact that, Rareware, put all this time and effort into putting out Conker's Bad Fur Day, it bombing, and then them trying to paint it as some massive W against Nintendo, like, oh man, Nintendo tried to censor us, which isn't true by the way, and we still put the game out anyway. It really showcases their lack of real priority because, Conker's Bad Fur Day has a lot of technical problems. It is very simplistic. It is convoluted. It's not all that funny, right? Conker's is actually a pretty weak N64 game, all considered. People only give it a pass because, oh man, it's just like South Park. It's so mature. People don't actually talk about its values as a game at all. Yeah, and that's the big major takeaway from I think modern Rareware. The thing I've been saying for a long time is that the problems with the company were very prevalent even in the 90s, where they were just pulling all these stunts, antagonizing Miyamoto and doing things they weren't supposed to do. And yet, yeah, eventually they got kicked to the curb. And today, although we still yearn for the glory days of Rareware and consider it an all-time golden period for classic Super Nintendo N64 era titles, the general Nintendo audience has moved on. There are better games out there now. I don't necessarily feel as if Rareware is ever going to have a return to form. And honestly, after everything they've done, I don't really want them to. Just let Rareware be a relic of the 90s. Yeah, those games have stood the test of time. They're some of the all-time greats, they're super popular on Nintendo Switch Online, and I'm looking forward to the day DK64 gets re-released. But we do need to acknowledge like the reality of the situation, right? Um, as Xbox gets phased out, Rareware is going to be allowed to work on Nintendo hardware anymore again. Actually, they've always been allowed to when it comes to like Nintendo handhelds. They put out the Donkey Kong Country games, remakes on Game Boy Advance, stuff like that. They just choose not to. Okay, like Rareware could at any time like choose to like produce games on Nintendo hardware, to produce games with Nintendo again, to like go back to the way things work, but they're not going to. They don't have the ability, they don't have the talent, they've completely fallen off. Like too many people blame Microsoft and not the company themselves. Seeing this massive crash out, over the Microsoft layoffs, all I can think of is that like that scene in Joker, when he's facing down like um that random actor that has never been in anything relevant ever. Like you get what you fucking deserve.